Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick. Welcome to the Enemies List. My guest today is Miles Taylor, friend of the show, great guy all around. You know Miles. He is one of the folks who spoke out from inside Trump world and is now, he's written a terrific book called Blowback, which is now out in paperback. Wanted to have him back on the show because we talked a couple months ago and we both sort of walked through all the predictions that we could see coming about where Trump would head in this campaign. And we were, weirdly enough, on point. So, Miles, welcome back to the show. Congratulations on getting the paperback out. Tell us a little bit about where you see the state of the race right now, and remind folks who didn't hear the last interview what Blowback is all about.
Rick, it's great to be with you. I'm on a quixotic odyssey to try to cost you as many listeners as possible. So if you could just hit the unsubscribe button and block Rick on every social media platform. I'm just kidding. He's the greatest. Rick, I appreciate it and everything that you've been doing. Look, let me give you an indication of how stupid this moment is that we are in American life. Is when I was with you last summer, and I released this book. It was called Blowback, and the subtitle was A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump, because a lot of folks, myself included, hoped that the Republican Party would not nominate him and would take him down. Now, I was hopeful, but not optimistic necessarily. Well, he is the nominee. And so we literally had to change the subtitle of this book to be A Warning to Save Democracy from Trump's Revenge, because there isn't some other Republican who's going to swoop in and save us from this guy. And to me, not to put too fine of a point on it, this is civic suicidal ideation. I mean, as a country, we are considering throwing it all away. And that's really alarming. So, I mean, what's changed between last summer and now is that Americans seem to be not heeding the warning. It feels like a lot of folks like you and me are screaming into the void and saying, we've got to avoid this. And Trump has pretty much validated a lot of the conclusions that you've put out there, Rick, a lot of the predictions you've put out there and that I've put out there, which is that he wants to operate a second term in retributive fashion. So for 1 second, I just want to say to your average voter, what does that actually mean for your life? Because people will say, nah, I think life was better under Donald Trump. Well, let me tell you two things. One, under Donald Trump last time, you didn't get full Trump. You got Trump, who was regularly boxed in by the law, who was boxed in by his advisors. In the second term, he will not be boxed in. So you're going to get real Trump, which is number two, a man who wants to operate the federal government on the basis of his personal self-interest. So, if you live in a red state and you have a tornado, okay, well, Donald Trump's probably going to send FEMA to your aid. If you live in a blue state and there's an outbreak of tornadoes, Donald Trump's going to wait a beat to decide whether or not he sends FEMA in to help you clean up your home. Why? Because he wants to exact leverage and get something out of that Democratic blue state or governor, or maybe he doesn't send help at all. And if that sounds like a crazy thing, no, there's no way a president would decide whether to send federal help based on a state's political leanings. You would be wrong, because Donald Trump tried to do that when I was working for him. He tried to withhold aid to blue states and blue localities because they didn't like him, and he wanted those places to demonstrate fealty or give him something. I mean, this blew our minds. No president in American history has ever considered whether or not to support Americans in crisis based on whether they support him. But this guy did, and he would do it in a second term, and he'd be able to go forward with it. So that's what really spooks me, Rick, is we're walking headlong into that if we reelect the guy.
And I think one of the things that, as you say, we sort of screaming into the void, I look at a lot of the people that are covering this race right now, And my God, the both sidesism is absolutely crushing my soul today. You've got, the guys from Axios out this morning, Van de Heye and Jim Allen, saying basically like, oh, well, it's both sides are the same kind of crazy, and there's a big middle, and everyone. No, there's not. There's a party with a leader who is telling us right now he will go against the law. He will do what he chooses. He will not play by the rules, that there are no institutional boundaries. And you're exactly right. We, in the first term, the first 2 years, let's say the first year Trump was sort of getting used to the place, and there were a lot of competing power centers all sort of trying to maneuver and trying to steer him a little bit. Second year, he sort of let his freak flag fly a little bit more. And by the third and fourth year, he was largely off the rails. We're not going to walk in there with a Jim Mattis or a Rex Tillerson or a John Kelly or a Reince or anybody who they thought of as a grown-up last time. I'm not saying there were any heroes, but there were people who you could make an argument had some other institutional knowledge or capacity or seriousness. You will not be able to make that argument with the new Trump administration.
Well, I always say, Rick, that there were no heroes in the first term of the Trump administration, only survivors. And in a second term, it won't be the survivors around him. It will be the supplicants and the folks that are working really hard to implement any edict he has, even if it's illegal, rather than refusing illegal orders. But, that goes back to why I wrote this book in the first place. I didn't want to write this book. I mean, I've complained to you many times. I'm so insanely sick of talking about Donald Trump. I don't want to talk about this anymore. It's not what I like doing. I do
believe me, every day.
Yeah, I do technology policy. Those are the things I went into government to do, not politics. But we got to talk about this because our democracy is at risk. And so I got fed up watching a lot of these self-laudatory Trump books come out of people being like, this is how brave I was. Here's how amazing I was. And no one was painting us a vivid picture of what Trump 2.0 would look like. And so, at its core, this book and the updated version are meant to be the architectural rendering of what that second term would look like. So folks can understand in a very clear-eyed way, here's what he's going to do at the Justice Department. Here's what he's going to do in the spy community. Here's how he's going to take the Department of Homeland Security and use its counterterrorism officers to send them into cities to enforce his edicts. And people don't have to believe me. I mean, I spoke to 100 of my former colleagues in the Trump administration for this book, from the cabinet level all the way down to the staff assistants who sat outside the Oval Office to say, listen, guys, let's paint the picture. What does the second term look like? And it was much spookier than I expected. So, I don't know who still needs to hear this, but I hope that people will share the message and show what the, again, those architectural renderings are for a second term, because it's the last chance we have to safeguard this republic against democratic dissolution.
That's right.
I think that's what will happen in a second term, is he's going to weaponize the guardrails of government to instead start to attack those pillars. And we've never seen anything like it in American history. So, we're in the last couple of months here of an opportunity to turn it all around.
I think that's right. And I think that there are people who inside the Republican Party, there are a handful of grown-ups left, not many. You saw Mike Rogers the other day talking about Ukraine and whatnot. There are a handful of people who don't understand where to take it from here. They feel kind of hopeless. They feel trapped inside a party that has evolved into this Trumpian support system. But I think it's like Jay Rosen says, this is about the stakes. This is about what the outcomes are. It's not just the betting line here anymore. It's not just about the horse race. And I think too much of our political culture and coverage right now has gone back to that false framing that it's the liberal Democrat versus the conservative Republican. It's low taxes versus high taxes. None of that, I think, is real anymore, because we're now in a very new world, and I don't know that people are taking the warning you've put out in Blowback, or the infinite number of articles now about Project 2025 and all these other things. There's a broad infrastructure around this. There's a big plan around this that goes way beyond the election.
There really is. I mean, they have an intent, Rick, to cement the influence of MAGA for a generation. And folks were really wrong to think that after he left in early 2021, that Donald Trump departing the White House meant the eulogy of the MAGA movement. That is not what happened. The MAGA movement has come roaring back. It's in full control of the Republican Party. The last handful of adults that you mentioned are quitting Congress. They're getting out. They don't want to be in the game anymore. And they're just ceding it entirely to the MAGA wing, which, if returned into government, they'll do the same thing in government that they have systematically done over the past few years to the Republican Party. They've taken over every single lever of the Republican Party. We have to be clear. Now their next plan is to take over every single lever of the executive branch. So even if one day a Democrat then replaces a second-term Donald Trump, that they have embedded their people in government. That sounds really conspiratorial. It's not. It's what they've written down on paper. That is their intent.
They've literally written it down. Yeah, I mean, look, you and I are both been appointees, and it's a process where each presidency comes in and they get to name a lot of their political people into various departments. But what they're planning, and you could talk to us a little bit about Schedule F, which is their plan to politicize the entire government at almost every significant level, because I think people also underestimated the amount of friction that came from ordinary people inside the government who weren't political appointees, who said, whoa, this isn't legal, proper, correct, American, safe, etc. So talk to us a little bit about where you see the Schedule F idea and all this other stuff that they're absolutely saying outright every day.
Well, they want to replace those people in government, Rick, those line people, the government civil servants, which for almost the entirety of the history of the Republic, since the 18th century, the civil service has existed to faithfully enforce the laws without political favor. That's why it exists, so that we can have a Democrat or a Republican president, but we don't have to worry about getting our Social Security checks depending on who is in office. For the first time in American history, Donald Trump wants to change that. He wants to make sure the laws are enforced in a partisan way by replacing those people with what Steve Bannon calls the next generation of assassins. Assassins is the word that he uses to describe the people they want to put into government. I'm not saying this. He's saying this. And what does that actually mean for your everyday lives? Well, I mean, we saw this with folks sort of laugh about Sharpiegate when Donald Trump was trying to say that a hurricane was going into a state that it wasn't, because he refused to be corrected by the meteorologists. But I want you to imagine a world where everything down to your weather forecasts are politicized, because that's what Donald Trump wants. He doesn't want impartial information to come out of the government. So that's a huge concern. It's not just about the cabinet secretaries or their immediate lieutenants. It really is, Rick, about those thousands, tens of thousands of people below that level who he wants to stack with political appointees. But the thing I also say to fellow conservatives who are on the fence, who hem and haw and say, well, but, Joe Biden's too liberal, and, Trump may act crazy and tweet things, but, he'll at least govern like a conservative. Even to that, I say he will govern as the opposite of a conservative. We think about institutions that conservatives support, like the United States military. Donald Trump, trust me, I was there. He thought soldiers were boneheads. Law enforcement, he didn't support law enforcement. He thought they were the evil deep state. Those were the people that he opposed. And even his own supporters. Trump would talk in private about how he didn't want to shake their hands at events because they were disgusting.
Right.
He viewed his own supporters as disgusting,
They're disgusting.
trailer trash in his view. That's why he kept extra Purell on at all times. He always wanted to be able to sanitize his hands because he thought his supporters were gross.
Mm-hmm.
This man doesn't support the working men and women. He disdains the working man and woman, and he'll use a second term to make their life miserable to make his better. That's what's really disturbing to me as a conservative.
Yeah, and look, the fundamental principles of what I thought was American conservatism: adherence to the Constitution, obedience to the rule of law, the upholding the norms, institutions, traditions of the past. And Trump was a radical departure from that, and it turned out an awful lot of our fellow Republicans at the time really liked it. They liked the show, they liked the spectacle, they liked the whole noisy, bread and circuses approach that Trump took. I mean, stepping out of the governmental side of it for a second, what do you think it takes to break that spell? I mean, and I've talked to 1,000 people about this. I gave up on focus groups a long time ago because I sat in focus groups in 15 and 16 and 17 and 18, listening to Republicans like stare at the camera and say, no, I will never leave him, no matter how bad he treats me. What do you think breaks the spell eventually?
I'm going to give you a very honest answer, Rick, and this may not be the hopeful answer people want.
Mm-hmm.
I thought after 2020, the answer was losing. I thought losing the White House and the Senate and the House would be what shocked my former party into recognizing that Trump was the wrong person to have as the figurehead. That didn't happen. Even in 2022, MAGA underperforming in what should have been winnable races for Republicans, the losing wasn't enough to convince them. That, more than anything, I think displayed how cultish this has become. Even losing doesn't convince them. So what I worry is that it will take the forest burning down in order to convince them. It will take a Donald Trump returning to office and doing things that shock the conscience of those edge case supporters of him, those independents and disaffected Republicans who maybe voted for Biden last time, but they're like, I'll give Trump another shot. It's going to take those people being shocked and horrified potentially by what happens for the pendulum to swing back. Now, I don't want that to happen. I think that road, we might not be able to turn back from it if we go down that road. But like I said, it may take a forest fire here for people to really wake up and understand how bad this is. And at that point, it might be too late. And, it's people that I point back to all the time who I admire for their sober-minded characterization here are people like Sue Gordon, who was the deputy director of national intelligence under Trump, a great conservative, someone who worked in the administration. And when Sue goes out there and talks about this, she says very bluntly that in her view, as an intelligence officer, there's sort of a 50-50 chance that America survives this century in recognizable form because of what we're going through at the moment. I mean, just soak that in, people. Top intelligence officers who study foreign conflicts are saying we've got a coin flip's chance of the republic continuing because we're willing to take this gamble again on an obvious carnival barker. That's disturbing to me, but it may be that the destruction that he brings in the second term is the only thing that will wake people up. And I'll give you a note of optimism on top of that pessimism, Rick, which is that I always say I'm an optimistic fatalist. And by that, I mean, nature destroys everything it creates. It will destroy me. It will destroy you. It will eventually destroy our republic. But nature also creates from everything it destroys. So my optimism here is even if the worst happens, even if Donald Trump wins a second term, we always have the ability to reconstitute the republic, to reconstitute human freedom, and to push back against autocrats. We've done it before as a country. We can do it again. But let's do ourselves a favor and not put ourselves at the brink. And that's what we need to be thinking about over the next few months.
It's a really interesting point is that was something that Americans and conservatives in particular were enormously proud of for 70, 80 years after World War II, is that we had stood up against authoritarianism in that war. That and they were enormously proud of the fact that we stood up against authoritarianism during the long struggle of the Cold War. And now, we see the polling that's out this week. We see a lot of an emerging majority of Republicans are sort of obsessed with executive power and increasingly willing to see it used, as long as it's with Trump using it, in ways that I think have absolutely mortified traditional conservatives. But where do you see Trump going on the foreign policy front? Because that's something that you and I share some background in, and the national security front. I mean, my view of it is that as bad as people think it will be with him sucking up to Putin and all that, it's probably so much worse.
Yeah. In blunt terms, I would say a second term of Donald Trump becomes the biggest pivot point in U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War, because what he wants to do is detonate what we call the post-war consensus after World War II. What was that consensus? That consensus was that free countries, free trade, free people were better than dictators, autocrats, and closed systems. And we agreed as the Western world to try to promote that, to make sure that people who lived in free and open societies were able to remain as such, and that we could expand human freedom around the world. Donald Trump does not share that view, and he wants to break all of those institutions that we created after the post-war order, namely the things that allow for free trade, organizations like NATO. That sounds really distant and academic to your average American. This is how I want them to think about it. The ways you travel, the ways you buy things, the way you live will change completely if Donald Trump decides to tip the balance of power in the world in favor of autocrats. He wants us to be friends with China. He wants us to be friends with Russia. He wants us to be friends with North Korea and Iran. In his heart of hearts, he sees dictators as closer buddies than democracies. That is a very, very different world for Americans to live in. And he will be able to start reshaping America's foreign policy in his own autocratic image if he wins a second term, because that's where the president's power is most unfettered, is in defense and foreign policy. And again, we give a lot of credit to the so-called adults in the room, those of us who were there the first time, but there were years that they prevented Trump from going down this path. He lost a lot of time because the John Kellys and Jim Mattises said, no, you can't do that. You'll put America in danger. But Trump didn't think so. And he'll have at least 4 years, and probably try to extend that if he wins a second term, to upend U.S. foreign policy. It puts not just the American people in danger, it puts their livelihoods in danger, because the entire way we transact business in this world will be transformed by a president who wants to team up with autocracies. That is what it means.
That's a really interesting point you made up, and that is one thing that, the founders understood, that foreign policy was going to be an area where the president would have to have more latitude and more authority. And it is something that he can do ministerially without a lot of intervention from Congress if he becomes president again. And for everybody that thinks that there are any guardrails, I mean, who's going to hold the wall back? Lindsey Graham? Who's going to hold the line in a modern Republican House of Representatives? Mike Johnson? Hardly.
Let me give you a scary example, Rick. Is one scary example that folks don't realize is, one of the things towards the end of the administration that Donald Trump was thinking about, which was he found out he has the authority under immigration law to essentially deputize people who are outside of the federal government to go enforce certain federal laws like in immigration. And they belatedly started to work up
what could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. They started to work up a plan to say, well, is it possible for us to deputize militia members to go enforce immigration law? Can we go take state and local law enforcement in friendly states like Texas and deputize them to enforce federal law? And there were lawyers who took the interpretation that, yes, Donald Trump could. He was very eager to do this. He'd asked us to do things like that when I was in the administration. I want you just to think for a second, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, how crazy this will get if Donald Trump starts to create his own parallel law enforcement structure adjacent from the normal aspects of oversight. And you'll have a little Trump army. He can create his own mercenary groups. He can deputize other people to enforce federal laws at his whim. We have never seen that in the history of this country, a president having his own armed force to enforce the law the way he wants. That sounds crazy. It's doable. And they've spent the past few years trying to bubble wrap that in legalese to make it possible. This is what we could be walking into in the first month of a Trump presidency, is him invoking the Insurrection Act to start laying the predicate to deploying those types of powers. That is not a world I want to live in. That's not a government any of us have ever imagined.
And as I say to people all the time, the both sides argument is not going to matter when you're being loaded into a boxcar, because these people, it's hard for me to make them a lot of people believe sometimes just how much the Millers and the Bannons of the world want to reshape this country. They want to burn it down and build something that none of us recognize. So with that, Miles, I want to thank you for coming on the show again today. Folks, the book is Blowback. It's the paperback edition, available where all fine books are sold. I want to ask you one more question before we go. When you were writing the paperback version, what was the biggest thing that surprised you from the time you'd written the original hardcover to the paperback? What was the one thing that really shook you or surprised you the most?
Denial. There was so much denial, I think, about the return of Trump. I've been, not that I'm Nostradamus, and you and I, Rick, have been seeing the writing on the wall since Trump left office. But there was a general sense, and I mean from publishers all the way down to your average American, of the fact that this wouldn't be relevant, that we would move on. Don't worry, you're hyperventilating. Trump's not going to come back because either the court cases are going to take him out, or the investigations, or the primary process. And I think it was worrying to you and I how much time people wasted just assuming that the problem would fix itself. And even last summer, when I was doing the rounds and talking about this, folks were like, yeah, but, there's a really good chance this is all taken care of in the primaries. And that denial, I think, has been what is both surprising and unsurprising, but also just really chilling. We can't be in denial. And the last best hope here are the voters themselves. We're not going to be saved by some other institution. We're not going to be saved by the courts. We've got to go save ourselves. Keep this man from being reelected. So I appreciate everything you're doing on that front, Rick. I urge folks to share this tone.
Likewise, brother.
With friends or family who need to hear it. And let's keep fighting the good fight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Miles. Appreciate you. See you again soon.
Thanks, brother.
So today, this is an easy one, folks. This is not even like a question. Today's enemies list, the pinnacle of it, perhaps, in the last few weeks, is Moscow Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's been on the list before because she is one of the worst human beings in America and is an enemy of American liberty, freedom, democracy, the republic, sanity, clarity, manners, discourse, civilization, etc. She spent the weekend howling and moaning because she got spanked on Ukraine aid. Mike Johnson, who I don't care why he did the right thing. I don't care that I'm not going to call up Mike and go for long showers and romantic moonlit walks, but he did the right thing. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is racing around right now, screaming into every microphone she can find about the motion to vacate, the motion to vacate. Folks, what you saw is that this person, the parallel tracks of her cruelty and insanity are now matched only by her political impotence and irrelevance. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, you are, as always, on the enemies list.